Okay, we're recording. We're good to go.
All right. Okay, so welcome everyone to this lunch talk. The talk today is going to be on inclusive language and just best practices in general. This talk is fairly timely given that today is the International Trans Day of Visibility. And with a lot of really unfortunate current events inspired by ignorance, we really wanted to give a quick language check to make sure that your words are matching your intent, because language is one of the main ways that we use to communicate with each other. We're going to take this in three parts. Relating to gender, LGBTQ issues, and race and ethnicity. At the end, we will talk very, very briefly about the concept of intersectionality and how, even though we present these as three separate topics, for many people, these issues are entwined together. And we also have to highlight how these slides are compiled based on best practices from experts and from literature, and also from our own personal experiences. But there really is no one perfect way to do this. But these should be pretty safe starting points for most situations. So first, it's some quick terminology. When it comes to gender, we have particular gender identities. Cisgender, meaning a person who's identifies as the gender they were assigned at birth. This is what society kind of considers the default. And it's what people traditionally assume that you are unless you say otherwise. Transgender is the opposite, a gender identity that differs from what was assigned at birth. A non-binary is just a person that identifies neither wholly as male or wholly as female. And it can be any number of identities. Some common ones are genderqueer, two-spirit, agender, bigender. None of them mean the same thing, and people have different terms that fit them better. And non-binary people may or may not identify as trans, and that's something that is generally a personal choice for them. And so this graphic was one that we actually saw initially at the Access assembly that we went to last summer. Here's the citation for that, for the actual where they got that site from. And it's the genderbread person, basically a kind of easy way to talk about the different aspects of what different components of gender. You have gender identity, that's kind of what you are in your head, whatever is happening on outside. Gender expressions, what you typically see, the way someone is dressed, the way they do their hair, any kind of thing with that. Biological sex, that is the biology basically, and from female to male to intersex and kind of in between. And then sexual orientation is obviously related to your relationships with other people: heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, queer, asexual, everything on that. And the main thing that we really wanted to get across from this picture is that the only thing that you really see when you're first talking to someone, first meeting someone, is their expression. Basically, you can only really kind of you only know what you see. You only know kind of how they dress, and everything else could be anything else, basically. Um, and so it's really kind of important to keep that in mind and make sure that you're not putting your own ideas and your own assumptions onto certain people and letting them kind of identify themselves for you. And Kat, you're on.
So we know that the patriarchy and society have continuously perpetuated these gendered stereotypes. So generally, stereotypes about women include being emotional, kind, giving, whether that's with their time or just like literally giving. And while there's nothing wrong about showing your emotions, being kind and generous, the issue with this stereotype lies in assigning the gender to it. And this also implies that men are then serious and unemotional and kind of not in tune with their emotional side. And then this also leads into the stereotypes about men, which is typically associating them with being brilliant and these natural born leaders. So again, brilliance and leadership skills are really great things, but they shouldn't just be limited to a specific gender. And while these specific traits that societal norms perpetuate, non-binary folks are usually met with this huge looming question mark that in turn actions and nonverbal behaviors then leave them feeling unwelcome, and at times their very presence or engagement in events or environments like even STEM and physics is just unsettling to other folks. But it's important to remember that non-binary folks are just that. They are people, and they shouldn't be treated as less than gender conforming folks, because everything is a choice. And again, like Jenna mentioned before with the genderbread, it's an expression, right? So women and non-binary folks in STEM, especially in physics, get kind of what we call stereotyped squared, since these spaces typically have been occupied and gatekept primarily by white males. So in the classroom and group work settings, women and non-binary folks are typically given or assigned these roles of being the secretary or the scribe of the group. And this results in them not being treated equally as their male counterparts. So you can see them being spoken over, or sometimes they contribute an idea to the group discussion, but then no one hears them, and then a male student in the group repeats their comment almost verbatim most of the time, and then is magically heard and given the credit for the idea that wasn't theirs to begin with. So it's important to be sure to attribute credit to where credit is due. So when it comes to money, Asian and Pacific Islander women make 85 cents, Black women make 63 cents, Native women make 60 cents, and Hispanic, Latina, or Latinx women make 55 cents on the dollar as compared to white men. And these are current statistics from the Department of Labor, so there's a big disparity here. Men have either been taught directly or through societal norms implicitly that they should negotiate, and they have this right to negotiate for better pay, and they typically ask for raises more often than women and non-binary folks do. So when it comes to work-life balance, working women typically have a lot more familial responsibilities than men, and they're expected to work at the same level of efficiency, and then are labeled as procrastinators, lazy, unmotivated, distracted, emotional, or even easily stressed or overwhelmed. And then at the same time, given all these labels, they're just less likely to ask for time off. And when they do, they're also kind of asked and expected to explain. And sometimes they're pushed to provide more personal details about why they're seeking this time off as compared to their male counterparts. So when it comes to leadership positions that I briefly mentioned when we're talking about gender stereotypes, men do typically hold more leadership positions, especially in academia. If we're thinking about the STEM and physics environment, they usually serve as chairs of committees that are made to address diversity issues, which can range from equity, inclusion, or even just, retention, and also on gatekeeping committees. So men are also usually the ones that are elected or self-elected to present the findings of these committees or lead conversations on behalf of their professional groups or committees with the people in higher positions of power. So if we're talking about this academia environment, they would be presenting these findings to like the dean or to like the college or even the university as a whole. And then when it comes to service opportunities, those quotation marks are on purpose, women and non-binary folks in STEM are consistently tasked with the "we don't have enough women here, fix the problem for us" issues. And they're expected to continue to say yes and serve in as many capacities as possible to drive that change. That is very needed. But as the targeted parties where these committees and opportunities are made to try to make the place a little bit better, they typically have potential solutions that would work and are pretty actionable and maybe easy, maybe not easy to implement, but they do share them with the group, but for the most part, it's overlooked by the majority of the folks in these spaces, which are typically white folks.
And so when we zoom back into just academia as a whole, and we wanted to talk something about Letter's recommendation, because there's been a lot of literature on how there is unconscious bias in these. I have a citation down here. University of Arizona has compiled a bunch of those sources. And just a couple of stats on that. First, letters for men are 4 times more likely to mention more achievement type things, the publications, the presentations they give, some kind of big situation with that. Whereas women are more likely to have they're more likely to have an emphasis on their effort or their hard work. Letters for men are around 16% longer on average than those for women. And what was really kind of upsetting to me is letters for women are 7 times more likely to mention their personal life, which is something that in 99% of situations isn't really going to be relevant in a professional context. And then we have what are called minimal assurances that are more commonly attributed to women. Those, I have kind of an extreme version here where she can do the job versus she is best for the job. But it's basically just means that if you kind of having that extra confidence and extra power behind your statement or whatever, that this person is definitely suited for this and would not just do well, but they would succeed, they would thrive there. And Kat mentioned this a little bit when it comes to kind of gendered adjectives and the connotations that they have with that. We can see things in these large recommendation: caring, compassionate, helpful versus leader, skilled, and accomplished. All of these are good character traits, and all of these are things that we should aspire to be and we should hope to be. They're all good. But when you skew most of your adjectives towards one side or the other, particularly the former, that can evoke stereotypes that can hurt an applicant. This was a commission that was done across all students. I think it was mostly grad students for it, but there's one particular paper on chemistry and biochemistry. It's a little bit closer to physics, and there have been several tools that have been made to kind of help counteract bias in your own writing, because you don't notice it's happening. It's something that's ingrained. It's habit. We're creatures of habit. It's hard to break. And so there are these two kind of web tools that you can use, basically put your letter in, and they kind of list out words that you may want to flag and may want to take a look at again. You may not need to, like the words might be absolutely valid, but it's just something to keep in mind. And then also here's kind of a one-pager from Lehigh University that gives through similar ideas. So like I said before, today is the Transient Visibility, so we definitely wanted to hit on LGBTQ issues. We're going to focus mostly today, kind of just very quick overviews of trans-affirming language, non-binary issues and inclusion, and then best practices for discussion. If you want to learn more about this, I definitely recommend checking out this climate report here. It is very, very thorough, and it's one of the things that I looked at a long time ago when I was first trying to figure out what to do in this talk. So trans-affirming language, it's more than just the pronouns, it's more than just getting the names right. It's really it's also a lot about the treatment, how you refer to each of those things. That means things like saying her pronouns are she, her, hers, as opposed to saying he prefers he, him pronouns. You also want to because they're not preferred pronouns, they're the pronouns that are chosen, it's just a fact basically at that point. Also avoiding pointing out previous identities or separating or making a distinction from cisgender. This can get tricky because some people, for them to be authentic, they do make distinctions themselves from cisgender, but usually there's some nuance to there that you can't tell from just your initial interactions with somebody. Like I said earlier, with the genderbread man or genderbread person, trying to avoid assuming gender presentation equals gender identity equals sex. And like we said before, this is really, really hard. So, because habits and society, and it is stuff that it's hard to kind of keep track of. I mean, I messed up genderbread man, genderbread person, just literally right there. So when do you mess up? Quickly correct yourself and move on. Don't send the conversation on your mistake and put, tons of apologies, like, oh, I'm so sorry, and try to make you feel better. It's more uncomfortable than anything else, basically. Just, like I said, sorry, person, moving on. So non-binary issues, there's a lot we could talk about here, but there's actually not a lot of information because their issues are not studied to the same extent as those of a gender binary. And many of the reasons that are kind of cited why this happens is because there's a lack of statistical significance, because there's not too many of us, or they require a selection between discrete gender options. I ran into that a lot with postdoc applications. So you basically, instead of being able to just kind of pick something else, you have to kind of fall into either male, female, or the dreaded does not want to disclose. Also, many times non-binary people are lumped in with women or whatever gender they look most like, but typically women in safe spaces. That can cause gender dysphoria because the whole reason is basically that there is a difference there. Typically, one way to kind of fix that is just to make sure that everything that you say is inclusive of all genders and includes everything, and just being careful with your language there. There is a recent white paper out here, and we're going to hit on more of them as we go farther down into the resources. But this is one that I specifically kind of popped up for the 2022 or whatever decadal survey. Non-binary faction looking towards the future gender and gender equity in astronomy. I believe all of the authors or co-authors that are listed here were non-binary. They have a little comment there, and they give you suggestions of what they recommend for even just kind of taking data on this and figuring out what is best. And then finally, we kind of talked about this a little bit more, basically best practices for these discussions. Like I said, avoiding assigning identities, allow students to self-identify, because it doesn't really matter too much in some cases, the way you interact with somebody. So let them kind of tell you what they tell them, like let them tell you what pronouns they want to use, what everything else. One way you can do that is by modeling. Basically, you can introduce yourself with your pronouns, add them to your email signatures. While that's great, I also recommend not making it a requirement for everyone to do the same, because that can kind of cause extra stress if somebody is not sure if they want to disclose those just yet, whether it's because they're questioning and they're not sure themselves, or they're not sure if they're comfortable in this area. And they're kind of left with a choice between, do I give more information that I'm comfortable with, or do I, pick the societally acceptable option and then kind of like betray myself in a way. One thing that I think everyone should be doing, and maybe it's just because I have anxiety and so I do this all the time, but I practice so many conversations with people and by myself. And so it's very, very natural for me to, if I hear that something is different, to just practice it for all by myself. So you can say, my student Avery, they did really well in that test, and kind of keep doing that until it becomes natural. Like you just immediately associate Avery, they, and it's just easy, basically. And that's one way that you can practice on your own without having to really put any of the onus on the student. You can avoid presenting gender as a binary, he or she. They is shorter to say, and it's more inclusive, so why not? And then just from my own experience, when a student is talking about their identity with you, there's a couple different ways that people have reacted. And what's going to laughing because it's kind of funny. Basically, there's always some kind of element of surprise because, like Kat said before, there's a norm, and then once people go outside of the norm, humans just don't know what to do with that information, basically. And so sometimes you end up, just because you're human, you get that look of surprise. You get automatic questions of needing to know more. What does this mean and everything? And there's a time and place for that. It's typically not the first time you're talking to the person or you're learning out this information. And so if a student comes out to you or says something about their identity, happy and supportive is good. It's also, you don't want to go over the top. It's not a party. It's a part of them. It's just a fact of life. Also, too, because once again, there is context clues to everything. This is assuming that the conversation is centered around the student's identity. If you're talking about, your plans for the weekend, and your student mentions that he's going on a hike with his boyfriend, you don't need to stop conversation for that. It's just a piece of information. I know, but it's happened. So okay, and then Kat.
Those are great points. All right, so in thinking about race and ethnicity, right? So traditionally, Latina or Latinx and Black women have been stereotyped as being bossy, having a bad attitude, being sassy, and presenting as unprofessional by their choice of expression, whether it's, the clothes that they wear, the way they style their hair, jewelry that they wear. While men are labeled leaders, taking charge, being assertive, and setting new trends for pretty much the same action. So this is obviously a problem when we're thinking about these stereotypes. So these stereotypes hold even truer in STEM and physics settings, where these folks are met with different reactions and often have to resort to tucking away part of their culture and identity to make others feel more comfortable. Or if they choose to embrace it proudly, as it is their right, and they should if they're comfortable too, sometimes they end up being targeted as a result of their choices. So in the classroom and in group work settings, underrepresented minority students, or URMs, you're going to see that abbreviation as we continue, have kind of an extra component to deal with on top of these, societal gender roles. Latina, Latinx, and Black women are even treated sometimes as the janitors or aides of the class and groups. And, sometimes professors just don't think twice when they're like, oh, can you go grab an eraser for me? Or can you go grab a marker for me? But they're specifically asking these underrepresented students to do that. Or sometimes they're treated like the aides of the groups, so they have to clean up and leave things orderly. If people have to move their desks, for group work, they're like, oh, make sure the classroom looks good when we're done. So we would like to clarify some assumptions for folks that may be unaware or just implicitly holding on to them. Latina or Latinx and Black women do not fit into one stock image. This is I will say this to the end of time. Their backgrounds range from a variety of cultures, and because of this, their melanin literally ranges. It is never okay to question someone's race and to probe them and to kind of force them to prove to you that their race is what they say it is. So instead, you can flip the script. The first thing you can do is pay attention and just kind of like reflect to yourself and think, are the words that I'm using, are they authentic, thoughtful, and carefully chosen? But is it not going too far as to make discussions awkward with others? You can learn from other people. So you can ask, your colleagues, students, professors, if they've experienced or witnessed biased behavior. And I feel like the majority of them probably will have experienced that. I know I have. So you can ask them, what did that look like for you? What was said? And keep in mind that this is from a point of learning. It's not to poke people and to get them to just open up about their trauma to you. And if they say that they did and they give you kind of a general explanation and they don't feel comfortable sharing more than that, that's okay. And you shouldn't be like, I must learn, tell me every single detail. That's not really the place to do that. So you can also be accountable. You can ask a colleague or your students, can I count on you to give me honest, constructive feedback if I use words or actions that are hurtful or offensive to you in the moment or later? But I think this was kind of created for like a workplace. So I wanted to add a note about dealing with power dynamics. So you definitely want to acknowledge them, especially if you are in a faculty member role or if you're an advisor to a student and you want to have this conversation with like the students in your research group or in your classes. Be mindful of it. And you can even add like an extra sentence and say, I know there's a power dynamic and I want to do my best to be open to your feedback. I promise I will not retaliate. And I want our conversations to not affect the dynamic that we've worked so hard to have in place. So instead, by being able to listen to your feedback, it's going to help me become a better advocate for you, a better professor, advisor, etc. So while it may be easier for you to have this conversation, it's okay to regularly check in and hold yourself accountable to your own words. If you're willing to have this conversation, you also need to be willing to make changes if you are asked to do them. So I know that personally, I've experienced some folks that have been willing to make those changes, and it's been really rewarding and wonderful to see. But I've also kind of seen the other side of the coin where they just have the conversation and then it ends right there. So that's just something to keep in mind. So we can look at some different scenarios, right? Someone says, so how did you get this new position? This could be like a fellowship, a grad school acceptance. It could be a variety of things. The impact of this is that you're questioning the qualifications of the other colleagues, students, or faculty, and it can make them feel that they always have to prove themselves to be worthy in the role that they currently have. The research says that some folks assume that people of color have benefited from special treatment, whether it's affirmative action or a quota system, and then are just not qualified. But what you can do instead is to congratulate them on the new position or accolade that they received. And you can ask questions that is like, shows that you're interested, and just say, what energizes you about this new role? How can I support you? Whether it's in transition or just congratulating them. That can go a long way.
And just
So,
to kind of put it with, sorry, and just to kind of put it from academics part, like if you want to actually, because it is relevant and helpful to learn more about how people got positions, a better way to word is like what advice you have for other people and everything. That kind of keeps it on their thing. It's the same thing where this comment is used so many times, seemingly like with on maliciously, not issue, whatever, but it's something that can be problematic or can hurt people.
Yes. So I want to highlight, that's really important, that a lot of times these phrases, the reason why they were included in an article is because they're so commonly used. And sometimes people don't have a bad intent behind it, but it still affects people negatively, which is why we're just pointing them out. So the next thing is, someone says, she speaks English so well. That's not really great to hear. So the impact of this is that it insinuates that racial or ethnic minorities are outsiders who can't speak English and don't really belong where they live or work or go to school. So research says that people of all races and ethnicities can speak English well. What you can do instead is just congratulate your peer on the content of their work. Like, again, you don't have to throw a party. You can keep it simple, say an encouraging line or two, and you can move on. So someone says you are overly sensitive. The impact of this is shutting down authentic conversations. You're disempowering the individual and shaming people by diminishing their experiences, feelings, and sense of worth. And the research says that minimizing another person's experience can naturally raise tensions, lead to defensiveness on the individual's part, and also just reinforce this idea of exclusion, that you don't belong here. So what you can do instead is just step into the other person's shoes and learn more about their experiences. You can say, I recognize that this is really important to you. I'd like to understand more. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? There's different keywords you can use. Another scenario is someone says, you are so articulate. The impact of this is that it implies that you had lower expectations, possibly because of the person's race or ethnicity. And the research says that this reinforces the stereotype that people of color and ethnic minorities are less competent as compared to their white counterparts. And that those who are successful are kind of like an exception to the rule, like, oh, you went above and beyond what we ever expected could come from someone from your race. So what you should do instead is to provide concrete examples of why and how you felt the individual excelled. You could say your presentation or assignment or research was really motivating, it was inspiring, I've never thought about it that way, that's so interesting. And then lastly, kind of the big one is, we don't see color, we only see people. And again, sometimes this is said with good intent, but the impact of this is that you're ignoring the differences, and this can stifle trust, authentic communication, and your ability to connect with someone who is different from you in some way. So the research says that it is not racist to see a person's race or ethnicity. In fact, again, we're talking about gender in society. It's just a natural tendency to see people, in the way that they present. Avoiding these conversations about race and ethnicity to maintain kind of a neutral environment, it's not going to create an ideal work, school, or research environment for everyone because they come from different backgrounds. So what you can do instead is ask your colleagues, students, faculty who have a different racial, ethnic, or cultural background than you if they feel like the environment that they're in honors their identity and experiences. So we also wanted to note that just the act of existing in STEM and physics spaces as a URM is pushing back on the norm that they don't belong. But that's not enough. There's a lot more that needs to be done. So Latina, Latinx, Black, Asian, Indigenous, and other URM peoples shouldn't have to feel this need to hide their culture out of a fear of being targeted, ousted, or making others feel uncomfortable. And some of the work that's being done to highlight the disparities include using critical race theory and counter stories, which is like what that article is highlighted up there. So these counter stories are stories from underrepresented folks that go against the stories of the majority. And they usually are presented in, they're collected through interviews, things like that, and they're presented in narrative form. So you can just read a story and it's really impactful sometimes to go and reflect on that. So we also wanted to touch on the power of names, and this kind of goes through the different topics that we are covering today. Some people, particularly members of the LGBTQ community, may change their names to more adequately fit themselves. And these names hold some serious power as they're chosen specially by the individual, and they can represent an embracing of their own identity. So it's not something that you want to just kind of ignore, especially if they have changed their names and not just like added a little bit to it. You want to make sure that you note that in your roster. There's little things you can do to make sure that you're carrying that power of the name. And names can also seem as difficult to pronounce to some people, but they do have a cultural or family significance for the most part. And since they do, these names were often chosen and spelled in I guess, non-traditional ways sometimes for a reason. If you're not sure how to pronounce it, it is perfectly okay to ask. And if you are corrected, because again, it's natural to just default to what you've learned from society. If you mispronounce it and you're corrected, you can quickly fix your mistake and move on. And like Jenna said earlier, you can practice on your own later. If it's something that you've been corrected a few times, you may need to set some time aside to just practice using it, and that's perfectly fine. So many first and or last names might have accents, which typically indicates a different pronunciation as compared to the standard English vernacular. So folks that use accents may have different reasons for doing so. And again, it just depends on the person and their own personal choice. And sometimes they're willing to share that and sometimes they're not. So some may use them to have that name pronounced in their native language or to show how it would be written in their native language as an honor to their culture.
And so, like we said, we were going to touch briefly on intersectionality. It's really briefly because we can spend an entire lunch talk just talking about this in particular. We wanted to highlight that even though, once again, we presented these kind of in three different categories, many people fall into multiple of these groups and they have unique barriers that pop up basically due to the intersection of their identities. That is essentially just the gist of intersectionality. And therefore, it's not possible to separate these identities, as many times exclusion and discrimination occurs due to the combination of these identities. If you're interested in learning more, Kimberly Crenshaw, this is one of the first, I think this is the first actual article I really went into this. She has a TED Talk and a bunch of other things. And also, this has just become it's everywhere. If you Google intersectionality, you're going to find a whole lot of information. But I recommend starting with her work because she was kind of the originator of all of this.
Yeah, so building off of intersectionality, we can think about positionality. And I know we're talking about a lot of alities, but bear with us. So we do need more folks advocating and putting the work in to instill equity in these fields and spaces, but you also need to be aware of your own positionality. And that's typically defined as your role and identity in relation to the context and setting of the different projects, or if you're doing STEM ed research, then research, and how those internal biases affect you as you engage in this work. So best practices are to engage in something that we call reflexivity, which is a systematic assessment of your identity, your positionality, and subjectivities as a person and as an advocate or researcher. And maintain an ongoing awareness and try to actively address your role and influence in the development and even implementation of new policies or changes for URM in STEM or physics. So being aware of your positionality and engaging in reflexivity are just some of the practices that we use in qualitative STEM physics education research. And there are two articles here that you can use to dip into the very large pool of literature that exists on it. And then some closing thoughts. So like we said at the beginning, there really is not a clear list of do's and don'ts to being perfectly inclusive. Language and norms are constantly changing with communities, and it's okay to work off of the best practices for now, but it's okay to follow some accounts that are good, that are people who are really trying to advocate for these changes, and you can keep up to date and stay adaptable as these norms change. There have been a lot of white papers published on DEIA issues, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And when we upload the slides, the link is there. And then also we wanted to make a note on equity. So equity is giving each student what they need to be successful. It's important to note that equity and equality are not the same thing. I know if you kind of hear the words, they sound similar and you're like, oh, same thing, it's just a synonym. It's not. Equity is the process and equality is the outcome or goal that we are striving for. And, in talking about different gender expressions and racial and ethnic folks, people are starting maybe in the same environment from different positions of privilege. So that's why it's good to be mindful of, doing equity work and striving for equality. And I believe that's all we have. I'll check the question form. I don't think we have anything there. So I can end the recording unless someone has questions.